Foundation.
Welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. I'm Howard Landau, a past president of the club. If you ask the man or woman on the street where the most volatile powder keg in the world is, they would likely say the Middle East, and with good reason. It seems as though there's always been trouble in the Middle East, but this time the problems seem more serious than ever, complicated by the sea changes that are happening in nations and groups across the region. To help us understand what's happening and what it means, our speaker at the City Club today is one of our country's most highly regarded experts on the Middle East, Aaron David Miller, Vice President for New Initiatives and Distinguished Scholar at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. His title is impressive, but he's probably better known as a senior advisor on the Middle East in the State Department, a role that he had for more than 2 decades under both Republican and Democratic administrations. He left the State Department in 2003 to serve as president of Seeds of Peace, an international youth organization, and joined the Wilson Center 3 years later. He's a prolific writer and appears regularly on the Sunday talk show circuit. His most recent article, which appeared this past Wednesday in Bloomberg News, discusses the 4 traits that make a great Secretary of State, a rather timely topic from a person who's worked directly for 6. Miller comes from good stock. Cleveland stock. He's the eldest son of Sam and Ruth Miller. I called his dad yesterday to see if I could get a couple of juicy tidbits from his years at the Shaker schools to use in my introduction. Sam laughed in that gruff voice of his and said he couldn't remember much from that time. His comment was more in line with our speaker's topic today. He said, Aaron has always been an optimist when it comes to the Middle East. I'm not sure if he's right, but I sure hope so. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Aaron David Miller.
Howard, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm sorry I'm late. There was a delay in air service from Washington. It's terrific to be here. It's the only speaking engagement that I really don't mind being a substitute for. This organization has a long and proud history. 2 of my favorite presidents, Franklin Roosevelt and Theodore Roosevelt, both spoke here. And as you know, it's the oldest, most traditional public forum in the country for speaking. It's also good to come to Cleveland because this is where I was born. And even though I've been in Washington now for almost 38 years, which is hard to imagine, this will always be, in many, many ways, my home. Friends guarantee that. Memories guarantee that. Family guarantees that. I've been around the block a few times since I left Cleveland in 1967, but I also believe firmly that my values are rooted here. My extraordinary mother taught me much about the way the world could be. My extraordinary father taught me a great deal about the way the world really is. And I would argue to you that both in life and in foreign policy, the challenge really is to try to find the balance between the two. To find the balance between the way the world really is, the way you find it, and the way you want it to be. Because if your prime philosophy in life is only looking at the world the way that it is, nothing ever changes. And if you make the mistake of looking at the world the way you want it to be, without taking into account the way that it truly is, you will fail. And it's an appropriate transition, frankly, for the subject today. I want to offer some observations about what I call the muddled Middle East. I had the honor and privilege to serve and provide a lot of advice to a half a dozen secretaries of state, George Shultz to Colin Powell. Some of that advice was well chosen and timely, but much of it was not. And some of it was really bad. And at times when it was bad, it was driven more by my and our own conception of the way we wanted things to be rather than the way it was. And it is the absence of clarity and honesty in life and in diplomacy and in foreign policy that gets great powers into trouble. That and the tendency to try to do too much, to aspire to too much, to believe as the greatest nation on earth that we have two capacities which no nation has. And they are transgressions if they are followed to the letter. One is the transgression of omnipotence, the notion that America can do everything. The other is the transgression of omniscience, the notion that America knows everything. When we get ourselves into trouble, I'll speak about that in a moment, it is because we come, perhaps for the best of intentions, to believe too deeply in our own capacity. And I would argue to you simply that we can no longer afford this kind of overreach. There was a time, perhaps, a brief period of time, perhaps the period 1945 into the 1980s, when in fact America had both the capacity to project its power abroad in an unchallenged way and to create the basis of real economic power at home. That moment, for many reasons, has slipped away. And we find ourselves now, I would argue, with a broken house. I call them the 5 deadly Ds: debt, deficit, dysfunctional politics, decaying infrastructure, dependence on hydrocarbons. These are challenges that ultimately will kill the national cohesion, power, and strength of this country. And the paradox is that they are unlike the traditional challenges which we have faced. We've had 3 great presidents, undeniably great presidents in 300 years. Washington in the 18th, Lincoln in the 19th, and FDR in the 20th. And their greatness coincided with nation-encumbering crises that they both managed to navigate, to overcome, and to leave in their wake a society and a political and economic structure that was better. One war has been kind to an American president in the 20th century, and only one. That was the second Roosevelt's war, because it had clarity, it had finality, and it left America stronger abroad and at home than it was before. No war previously or subsequently has those 2 attributes. We don't have this luxury anymore, which is why we need to be much more disciplined about how, when, why, and where we choose to project our power abroad. I'm not calling for withdrawal from the world. Isolationism is a myth. It never existed. We can't afford that either. We are, in many respects, still, as my former boss, Madeleine Albright, describes us as the indispensable nation, but that indispensability needs to be pursued in a much crueler and more unforgiving fashion before we project our power abroad. Exhibits A through Z are the 2 longest wars in American history. It's still a stunning fact to me. These are the 2 longest wars in American history, Iraq and Afghanistan. We're out of Iraq, still in Afghanistan. And victory in these wars was never, ever, even from the beginning, could we win. Victory was always, when could we leave? And extrication, the act of leaving, is hardly the kind of benchmark and metric that you want to use to judge the success and efficacy of a great power. And what have we accomplished? I'm not here to demean or trivialize the men and women who served, many of whom died. Many more received life-crushing injuries from which they will never recover. But I ask myself now, what was the purpose? Afghanistan was an imperative. We were attacked in 9/11, we responded, but somewhere along the line, Afghanistan moved off in another direction, and Iraq became a war of discretion, a war of choice. And in wars of choice, presidents need to be very, very, very careful, because the standards for judging a war that you do not have to fight much higher. So I don't know, and I cannot answer this question still. It's not a rhetorical question. I do not have the answer what was accomplished here. Thousands of Americans dead, not to mention thousands of Iraqis and Afghans, billions of dollars expended, and American credibility in tatters. It is a cautionary tale, and it is one that I offer up as a point of departure for my remarks. Nowhere I would argue, is this discipline more required than in the broken, angry, and dysfunctional world of the Middle East. We are truly in a conundrum there. We cannot fix this region, and yet we cannot extricate ourselves from it. And for the greatest power on earth still, and I am not a declinist, we are the greatest power on earth and will remain so. But for a consequential power to be stuck in such a position almost guarantees a degree of failure, or, to be more charitable, non-success. And my own analysis, my father on this is wrong, even though I persist in trying to explain to him that failure and reality intrude and must reshape the way people look at the world. Since leaving government in 2003, my own analysis on these matters has become, and these are my words, annoyingly negative. Annoyingly negative. But, to quote the words of one of our most preeminent philosophers, Groucho Marx, who are you going to believe, he said, or it was attributed to him in Duck Soup, who are you going to believe, me or your lying eyes? I see what I see. This is not an ideological prejudice. It is not a political prejudice. I worked for Republicans and Democrats. I voted for Republicans and Democrats. In my judgment, these matters are too important to become the hostage of either Republicans and Democrats. My own sense of this is that the new dividing line for America on domestic and foreign policy should not be between left and right, liberal and conservative, Republican or Democrat. The dividing line should be between dumb on one hand and smart on the other. Which side of the line do you want to be on? And that means exposing yourself to a variety of points of view, a variety of ideological biases. It means getting your news from a variety of sources and not validating your own prejudices by only tuning to one channel. No further explanation on that is necessary. I sometimes will do Fox and MSNBC interviews in the same day. That is a credit, it seems to me. These audiences both need to be reached with something that approximates nonpartisan analysis. But it's insane to validate your own prejudices by going to news sources that essentially have a stake for financial and political reasons in doing so. The muddled Middle East, we confront three basic challenges there, and I want to briefly describe them and then conclude. Number one, the Arab Spring, or more appropriately, the Arab Winter. Let me be clear here. In life, time is the ultimate arbiter of things of value. Time is required to test good marriages, good music, good wine, and a host of other things, good friendships. So to judge these historic developments by a year or two is wrong. It took us 150 years, a civil war, and a century and a half of struggle to even begin to reconcile the promises of equality identified in the Declaration of Independence with the legitimization of slavery contained in the Constitution. 150 years to do that. And we had the benefits of an extraordinary political system, economic abundance, and a security unparalleled in history. Non-predatory neighbors to our north and south, and fish, literally fish, to our east and west, what one historian rightly called our liquid assets. We are a blessed, and I don't mean this in a religious sense, we are a blessed nation given what we've been endowed with. Most other nations in the world aren't as lucky. So when these transformations occur, it's wrong to look at the narrow arc of history in 1 or 2 year increments. But you do have to look and see where the trend lines are headed. And the promise and heroism and courage that we witnessed in the initial phases of the Arab Spring have turned. They really have. We have imposed, and the media is not alone in this. The chattering classes and the analysts are at fault too. We have imposed a Hollywood trope on the Arab Spring. Democrats versus anti-democrats. Historic changes, liberals, seculars, the Google generation, social media, were going to transform these societies quickly. It's all very endearing, and it reflects the angels of our better nature, but it does not correspond to reality. It does not. 22 countries in the world since 1950 have maintained their democratic character continuously. 22, that's it. Turkey and India are not on the list. The world's largest democracy, India, is not on the list because during the 70s, democratic process was suspended. So the Democratic Club is a small one. You don't get into it quickly or easily. And to get into it, you need enlightened leaders that are prepared to transcend narrow party affiliations. You need inclusive institutions that are legitimate. And you need a capacity to contain political dialogue and politics generally in a nonviolent manner. I look and see what's happening in the Arab world, and it's a matter of dismay to me. In Egypt, as if there would have been any doubt, the two most anti-democratic forces in the country will ultimately determine the politics, the military and the Islamists, in one guise or another, whether it's the Brotherhood or the Salafis or any of their derivative organizations. And what we see in the streets can be viewed as a response to repression and arbitrary behavior, but you can't run a democratic polity with violence and violent demonstrations in the streets. It has to be contained as it is in this country, and it took a long time within institutions that were prepared to accommodate and be flexible enough to avoid and preempt violence. Nowhere do I see the trend lines as positive. Libya, the most pro-American country in the Middle East, lacks a centralized government, and it witnessed the first killing of a sitting American ambassador since Adolph Dubs was killed in 1979 in Afghanistan. It shows how small, determined, and in this case, Islamist elements can put an entire country in the dock. Tunisia, small, where the Arab Spring began, now is racked by tensions between secularists and Islamists. Syria is in the process of melting down. And even if the Assads go, as they will, the question is, will Syria remain a coherent, cohesive entity? Or will it become decentralized? With the Turks, the Saudis, the Iranians, the Iraqis, all playing and supporting their favorite parties in the struggle for Syria that has not yet begun. These are all long movies. Our capacity to reshape these in a way that is in our own image is a fool's errand. We can do certain things. We can provide economic assistance, I would argue, with some conditionality. We can stand up for our values in this region, which is extremely important. Our form of government is not for export. We are an exceptional people, but the exceptionalism stops at the water's edge. It really does. And while the principles that we stand for are worth promoting, the specific requirements necessary to recreate the American experiment elsewhere, they're not there. And we will be perceived as imperial and arrogant, and we ultimately will fail if we somehow think we can transport what we've created here somewhere else. Iran. Iran will be the key issue that will loom over this region next year. And the issue is very simple. The Iranians fashion themselves as a great power. Had the Shah not been overthrown by Khomeini in 1979, Iran would have already been a nuclear weapons state. Let's be very clear about this. Iran sees itself as a great power, and in many respects it is. A rich civilization, highly intelligent, stable politics, relatively speaking, and a capacity to project its power beyond its borders. Iran is also a nation driven by a profound sense of insecurity and entitlement. And if you met such a person walking down the street, you'd want to walk the other way, because profound insecurity and entitlement is a very bad combination. 4 nations have nuclear weapons outside of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council: North Korea, Pakistan, India, and Israel. All of them, to a certain degree, are profoundly insecure. Nations want nuclear weapons, in large part for reasons of prestige and to hedge against their own insecurities, and in the case of Iran, regime change. And I would argue quite simply, there's only one country in the world that will be able to stop Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon should they persist in their military nuclear program, and that is Iran. Should it reach the conclusion that the costs of acquisition of such a weapon are prohibitive. And the Iranians have not reached that conclusion. In fact, everything that they see in terms of the acquisition of the North Korean weapon, the Pakistani weapon, the Indian weapon, the Israeli weapon, suggests that they can have one too. The problem that the Americans face is what to do about it. Sanctions are punishing and imperative, but they will not work. And negotiations so far haven't. And that leaves the default position, which is the prospects of military action, either unilateral military action by the Israelis or action by the United States. And I submit to you that this president will go to extreme lengths, and I would argue rightly, to avoid a situation in which the United States is forced to use a military strike in order to deny Iran a weapon. In the end, he may resort to it because he's on record as committing himself to making sure the Iranians don't acquire one. But the question is the end state here. Once a society acquires the capacity in its scientific consciousness to produce item X, the question is, what do you do about that? Can you bomb it out of existence? Unless you change the acquisitive character of the mullahcracy, of the mullahs, repressive as they are, the chances of denying Iran at some point a weapon are very, very low. So the president will and must test the proposition that there is a diplomatic solution to this on the issue of enrichment. I don't know the answer to that. There is no honest man or woman in Washington or anywhere in the world that can answer that question honestly. None. And nobody, not the Israelis, not the Germans, not the Americans, have an answer to the question what to do about Iran's nuclear capacity, other than the options that I've laid out. The first two don't work. The third is very risky. And there are costs to action as well as inaction. Finally, the Arab-Israeli issue. Let me be very clear here. I spent the better part of my professional career working on this issue. And when I was in government for at least 15 years of the 25, there was a reasonable prospect that we could actually move, and we did, toward a better situation between Arabs and Israelis and Palestinians. The decade I was in government, primary decade, the 90s, was the only decade in the 20th century in which there was no major war between Arabs and Israelis. The only one. 48, 56, 67, 82. The 90s came and went without a major conflict. There's a reason for that. The Arabs and the Israelis, and even the Palestinians, who had not been players in the game, were more invested. Right now, it's almost unimaginable to me, and I want to be very clear now about what so I can render what I want to say very clearly. To imagine a conflict-ending agreement between Israel and Palestine, a conflict-ending agreement in which an Israeli prime minister could stand before the Knesset and a Palestinian president before the Palestinian Legislative Council and say to their respective peoples, we don't love you, we haven't reconciled with you, but all claims have been adjudicated on the 4 core issues: Jerusalem, borders, security, and refugees. We've abandoned all of our irredenta. Our conflict with you is over. To imagine that either the current Prime Minister of Israel or the current President of the Palestinian Authority could be in such a position anytime soon, to me, is fanciful. That's not to say that there are other outcomes that might not be worth pursuing. But the conflict-ending agreement cannot, in my judgment, happen. And it can't happen for 2 or 3 very basic reasons. Leadership. It's insufficient. And leaders are critically important to this enterprise. If I were to tell you that between 1930 and 1950, 6 men were responsible for most of the death, destruction, devastation, and prospects of peace and prosperity throughout much of the Western world, it's an astounding fact. 6 human beings. When we have watched breakthroughs in this Arab-Israeli arena, it's because you had leaders who were masters of their political constituencies, not prisoners of their political houses. And we do not have that right now on either side of the line. You want to pretend we do? Go pretend. Pick your favorite Israeli or Palestinian president or prime minister. Defend them to the hilt. Play the blame game. Put the onus on Israel or on the Palestinians. Make up an excuse. E1, Israeli settlements. What about Abbas's effort to become a non-state non-member observer state at the UN? None of it gets to the core issue. And the core issue is this. No Israeli or Palestinian leader is prepared to pay the price of what a conflict-ending agreement will cost. And they're not prepared to pay the price because it's risky and because the gaps that separate these 2 parties on the core issues, Jerusalem border security and refugees, and a 5th issue, which is the recognition of Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people, those 5 issues, the gaps are very large. And anybody who will tell you that at Camp David we were this close to an agreement is creating a mythology. I was one of the 12 Americans there. We were not this close to an agreement. We've never in the succeeding decade plus been this close to an agreement. We're this close to an agreement. You give me the leaders and an American administration that knows what it's doing, and maybe there's a chance. The last serious and effective foreign policy we had in this country was George H.W. Bush and his very talented, but thoroughly disliked, at least in the Jewish community, Secretary of State James Baker. We have not had on the Arab-Israeli issue subsequently, not under Bill Clinton, who I admired, not under George W. Bush, and certainly not under this president, have we had an effective policy. Marry ownership by the parties with an American administration that knows what it's doing, and then maybe, possibly, and I think we can have a serious negotiating process leading to an agreement. But until that materializes somehow, we shouldn't be bold and reckless. Bill Clinton said to us during the second briefing when we briefed him before Camp David that trying and failing is better than not trying at all. And I remember how moved I was by that, and it's quintessentially American. But it is not a substitute for the foreign policy of the greatest nation on earth. It is a more appropriate slogan and piece of philosophy for a high school or college football team. But it is not because trying and failing is better than not having tried at all. You know, there's a cost for failure. Failure costs. It undermines the credibility of the great power. And in life, what I found, the most compelling ideology is not nationalism, not communism, not capitalism, not democracy. Success is the world's most compelling ideology, because success generates power and it generates constituency, and failure generates the opposite. Finally, we cannot walk away from these issues. There are many things we can do on the Arab-Israeli issue, but to go for broke shouldn't be one of them. Not until there's a greater sense of ownership. And ownership in life is everything. It was Larry Summers who said, and I've used this line before, I think here, in the history of the world, Larry said, nobody ever washed a rental car. And there's a reason you do not wash a rental car, because you care only about what you own. It is a symptom, maybe an unfortunate symptom of the human condition. So, having been annoyingly negative, I'm going to conclude with one additional point. It was Jack Kennedy, the first and last president who ever had an emotional impact on me. I was 12 when he was assassinated, who described himself as an idealist without illusion. That's where we need to be. Idealism without illusion. Never giving up on the prospect that people, relationships, and the world can be changed. But as you go through the process of trying to alter these things, go through it with your eyes wide open. Thank you very much.
Today at the City Club, we're listening to a Friday forum featuring Aaron David Miller, Vice President for New Initiatives and Distinguished Scholar at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. We'll return to our speaker momentarily for the traditional City Club questions. Please formulate your questions now and remember to be brief and to the point. We welcome all of you and those listening on 90.3 WCP and Idea Stream, WCLV, WTAM, or one of our many radio stations across the country. Our television broadcast partner is WVIZ PBS Idea Stream. Television broadcasts of the City Club are made possible by Cleveland State University and PNC. Our live webcast is supported by the University of Akron. Closed captioning of our programs is made possible by the Nordstrom Corporation. We'd like to welcome our guest today at tables hosted by Barb and Abe Miller. Thank you for your support. And now we'd like to return to our speaker for our traditional question and answer period. We welcome questions from everyone, including guests. Holding the microphone today is Assistant Director for our 100th anniversary, Betsy Wallace. Thank you, Betsy. And our Development Marketing Coordinator, Michael Cromaldi. Who's got our first question? And Aaron, if you'd come back up. Thanks.
Thank you for being here today. I've come every time in Cleveland, wherever you're somewhere, but I don't remember the quote that you attributed to the last time possibly you were here. My question is, do you see a role for J Street in the Arab-Israeli issue at all?
I'll be very clear about this. I don't do what I would describe to you as inside Jewish baseball. I'm a member of the Jewish community. I'm a member of the Jewish community, a proud member of the Jewish community. But the reality is I don't think that's an appropriate point of departure for trying to figure out what an American president should or shouldn't do in the Middle East. I mean, the founders hated the idea of special interests and lobbies. But ultimately, in a country this large, with a political system this dynamic, they couldn't avoid them. And there's no question that domestic politics, in my judgment, is on balance, it has its imperfections. On balance, it is it's the lifeblood of this political system. Sometimes I hear senior State Department officials say, damn that Congress. I wish they weren't here, okay? Or the Jewish community, or the evangelical community, or the Arab American lobby. It misunderstands and insults, frankly, the nature of American politics. The founders created an open invitation to struggle. And the reality is, it is the president who ultimately has to figure out how to fashion an American national interest. I no more want the State Department in charge of our foreign policy than I would J Street, or the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, or any of the other special interest groups. It is a smart and fair and reassuring president that ultimately has to make the calls on what works or doesn't work for the U.S. national interest. So when, in fact, that happens, and you have an Israeli prime minister and a Palestinian president or an Arab leader that come together, as we've had so many times in the past, to actually own their own negotiations, then the American Jewish community, in all of its many parts, will come along. And that's, frankly, the way it should be. It's not the reverse. And J Street seeks to carve out a space for itself in an effort to provide a certain amount of refuge for legislators, senators, and representatives who have a particular view on the Arab-Israeli conflict. which is somewhat left of center. It's part of the game. But it is not the point of departure, and shouldn't be, for the formation and creation of American foreign policy. And I like, by the way, know and respect Jeremy Ben-Ami, who started this organization. I just don't do what I call Jewish inside baseball, because I don't think it's, frankly, terribly relevant in the end. In the end, there is a Jewish lobby. I call it the Jewish lobby of one. And it's composed of one person, the most important Jewish person in the peace process, which happens to be the prime minister, whoever the prime minister is of the state of Israel. That's what counts. That's what that's who an American president will listen to or not listen to, depending on the prime minister's views. Here, I'll actually take this.
Aaron, good to have you with us back home, and I know for those of us who had the good fortune of knowing and working with your fantastic mother, she would be extremely proud of what you have done and what you've accomplished. Many of us who do not have the grasp of the Middle East as you do sit there and wonder why, when we're trying to see peace come and get the two sides together, why would Israel continue to push these settlements and the current effort on the part of non-Jew, the fact that the world, so many people, nations are speaking out against this. What is the purpose? How can we possibly get any settlement issue if they keep pushing these settlements?
Every Israeli prime minister that we worked with and that I've analyzed, at least since 1967, played a role, including those who fall on the left of center side of the spectrum, in enhancing the settlement enterprise. And the origins and motives for Israeli settlement activity are many. Ideology, domestic politics, the need to keep a coalition together. Security, however, is not, in my judgment, among them. So a guy like Rabin, for example, who took extraordinary risks, was assassinated for taking those risks, was the Israeli prime minister who initially expanded Ma'aleh Adumim, which is the Israeli, it's not, I mean, I understand the lexicon, and I'm not suggesting they're not settlements, but they're also neighborhoods. Ma'aleh Adumim, 30 to 40,000 people would be comfortable anywhere in Southern California. These are large communities which have taken root. It was Rabin who expanded the limits of Ma'aleh Adumim. But Rabin as well would not build in this E1 area, which is where Netanyahu has now announced, not building, but planning process. So every Israeli prime minister is in part responsible, without exception, for the settlement enterprise that now exists. And whether or not that settlement enterprise, even as currently constituted, could somehow be made compatible with an independent or contiguous Palestinian state, I don't know. I really don't know. Netanyahu's motives, I think, are very clear. Number one, ideologically, this is something that's very compatible with his worldview. Number two, he is under great pressure from his right wing for concessions made in the recent Gaza ceasefire. And number three, on January 22nd, there will be Israeli elections. And four, Netanyahu does not, it's as natural as breathing. Jerusalem is the eternal capital of Israel from his perspective. And the areas in which Israel is now building, Ma'aleh Adumim, even though it is in the West Bank, E1, in the West Bank, Givat Hamatos, which is another large settlement enterprise, neighborhood, 2,600 residential units, which represents 5% of all of the units constructed since 1967. These are areas in which the Israelis plan, even if there was a serious negotiation right now, they plan to keep these areas. Facts on the ground are undermining the prospects for a serious negotiation. I would argue they are not the reason we do not have an Israeli-Palestinian negotiation. It is one of the reasons we don't, but it doesn't provide as full an explanation as is necessary. And American policy on these issues has been quite clear rhetorically, which is opposing these actions without much accountability. And that gets to the issue, you didn't ask the question, gets to the issue of tensions with Israel and pressure on Israel. The three breakthroughs in this region that we have participated in, and there have only been three. Henry Kissinger's disengagement agreements during the 70s, two with Egypt, one with Israel, Syria in the wake of the October War. Jimmy Carter's peace treaty, the only one that we have, brokered by an American president with Egypt, Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin. And Jim Baker's efforts to bring the parties together at Madrid. That's it. The Israeli-Jordanian peace treaty was negotiated by themselves. We catered for peace. We forgave the Jordanian king, late King Hussein's debt. We hosted signing ceremonies in Washington, but the Israelis and Jordanians did this on their own. All of those other breakthroughs had moments of serious tension between Israel and an American Secretary of State and American president. You cannot be an effective negotiator in this conflict and avoid real tension with both sides. But, and here's the but, the fights we had with Israel in the past were productive fights. They led to actual agreements. It was a fight worth having. To fight with a close ally, with a very powerful domestic constituency, without purpose, without reason, without cause, because it's morally the right thing to do, I understand the argument. It's stupid. You fight with Israel when, in fact, you can win. And that means you win as an American president, you win as an Israeli prime minister, and you win as an Arab or Palestinian leader. That's when it's worth fighting with the Israelis. Barack Obama decided, and I'm not entirely sure why, to make settlements the key issue in 2009. A lot of tough talk, a lot of big rhetoric. No follow-up. It was the wrong issue with the wrong guy at the wrong time. And the Israelis said no. And the president backed down. And thereby lost credibility, not only with the Israelis, but with the Arabs and the Palestinians too. It makes absolutely no sense. The next time he chooses to pick a fight with the Israelis, and he may, if in fact he goes through with an initiative on this issue, he really needs to think it through and make sure that the fight is a fight worth having.
The Secretary of State, of course, is Hillary Clinton. Every time I turn on the news these days, all the political pundits are saying she has been a great Secretary of State. Do you agree or disagree, and why?
I traveled with Hillary Clinton when she was First Lady on one occasion. It was Talea Rabin's funeral. And I have to say, she is one of the most, she has more style, more class, more smarts, more poise than just about anybody on the American political scene today. A great Secretary of State. We've had two, in my judgment, in the last 45 years, 50 years, two truly consequential Secretaries of State, and only two. And I worked for a half a dozen of them. The others that I worked for were wonderful. Each had their strengths, but two stood out. Henry Kissinger, despite all of his imperfections, and Jim Baker. To be a great Secretary of State, to get into the Secretary of State Hall of Fame, you need several things. You need a president who will watch your back in Washington and support you out in the rest of the world. You need a persona. When you walk in the room, people should be poised on the edge of their chairs, wondering and worrying, not comfortably situated, thinking about what they're going to have for lunch or where they're going on their next vacation. You need a bit of drama, and you need the negotiator's mindset, which is that the world instinctively looks like a jigsaw puzzle of unassembled pieces, and you somehow understand intuitively how to put those pieces together. Kissinger and Baker the lawyer and the Marine, Kissinger the academic, were not trained negotiators. Where their intuitive negotiator's mindset came from, I don't know, but they both had it. She has been a good Secretary of State. She has improved the nation's credibility and image through her relentless travel. She owns, I call it, an agenda of planetary humanism. These are 21st century issues, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transvestite issues, social media, technology, women's gender equality. These are cutting-edge issues for the 21st century. But because of his unwillingness, the president, to delegate, in combination with the cruel and unforgiving world in which they inherited, where in fact I'm not sure American diplomacy was all that compatible with the problems we face. The marriage of his unwillingness to delegate and the nature of the world conspired to not even give her an opportunity to test the prospect as to whether or not she could be a great Secretary of State. Great Secretaries of State take very difficult problems that you and I acknowledge are really hard, and they make them qualitatively and quantitatively better in some respect. Kissinger did that. Baker did that. She has not owned one issue of consequence, and it's not her fault. It's in large part because he is the most withholding foreign policy president, in my judgment, since Richard Nixon, which is why Susan Rice, regardless of whatever other imperfections she has, of the likely suspects as Secretary of State, if she can get confirmed, is the best choice because she is the closest to him. And she probably is the only one that can get him to delegate rather than dominate. And why does he have to delegate? Because second terms are notorious for scandals and screw-ups, because there is no way the White House can actually do everything when it comes to the consequential issues relating to diplomacy, and because it's good for the country. It truly is good for the country. And his primary achievement, my judgment, these 4 years, should be fixing the house that is broken. And that is another reason for delegating, because we cannot withdraw from this world. Somebody has to go out there and at least manage these problems that can't be resolved.
Thanks for coming today. I just wanted to, perhaps you dealt with this in your last answer, but you said a couple of times one of the most important things is that the United States knows what they're doing. And you dealt with that with regard to delegation, but would you have a specific plan or specific goals that we would have with regard to the Arab-Israeli conflict going forward in the second term that you think get their act together would suffice?
I think we need to do 4 or 5 things. Number one, keep the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty, particularly Egyptian-Israeli cooperation over Sinai, which has become an enormous problem. Part of the reason the ceasefire frayed is because there are jihadi elements, non-Hamas elements. Hamas, obviously, and its high-trajectory weapons is the main Palestinian actor. But Sinai offers, and has for centuries, smuggling routes. Most of the component parts for high-trajectory weapons are coming up the Red Sea with Sudan as a transit point, and then across Sinai into Gaza through one of the 1,200 tunnels that carry so much of the economic life, in large part because the Egyptians have closed the Rafah crossing to Gaza. That's one. Number two, try to figure out a way to ensure that the Gaza piece of this remains stable. That is to say, let Gaza breathe economically and try to get the Egyptians to do more to counter Hamas's efforts to replenish their stocks in terms of high-trajectory weapons. 3, keep Israeli-Palestinian security cooperation on the West Bank up and running between the Palestinian Authority, no matter how weak it may be. And 4, depending on what happens on January 22nd in Israeli elections, see if you can't quietly and discreetly get the prime minister's negotiators and Abbas's focused on a couple of the 4 permanent status issues. The 2 that are least complicated are borders, territory, and security. Try to get them focused on trying to identify where the gaps are to see what kind of progress you can make. I don't think, by the way, the president is, if I sat here and outlined these things for him, he'd shake his head and he'd say, this is my last 4 years. What you've outlined is management only, and I got legacy issues I need to deal with. So I would make a prediction to you that sometime in his next term, he is going to take on the Israeli-Palestinian question with a much broader purpose, in a much more active and forceful manner. And that will be a fascinating enterprise to behold, because it's a risky proposition, and the risk to reward ratio is heavily skewed toward the risk side. But nonetheless, I believe, since Barack Obama believes he is a transformative president, both with respect to domestic policy and foreign policy, that you're going to see in these next 4 years an effort to leave a legacy, to earn his Nobel, not to put too fine a point on it.
Mr. Miller,
Yes.
in light of the fact that we persuaded Libya, I believe with George W. Bush, to get rid of their nuclear weapons, wouldn't you say that that might just debunk any idea of persuasion or sanctions for Iran to get rid of theirs? What might you suggest?
Again, my view of this has been clear. The Iranians want at least the capacity to produce a weapon. The capacity. What I mean by that, they want to assemble all of the component parts and processes that are required to militarize, okay? So that within a discrete period of time, let's say 6 months to 8 months, they could break out, if they wanted to actually produce weapons. Now, CIA, IAEA, all of the, and most of the other intelligence agencies will argue to you that they do not believe that Iran has yet made the decision, let me be very careful with the way I say it, yet made the decision to actually weaponize, to actually produce a weapon. That decision hasn't been made yet. But they've hardened their sights, they've created redundancy and secret locations for the enrichment of uranium, which would probably, certainly put them beyond the range of Israel's military capacity to destroy them. Not ours, arguably, but certainly the Israeli capacity, the so-called zone of immunity. I mentioned before, I do not believe sanctions will work. And diplomacy has not yet been seriously tested. What a deal would look like, I don't know. But you have to, you really have to create a new bottom line for yourself. And the bottom line is this. Unless you change the regime in Tehran, I describe them as the malocracy, brutal, repressive, anti-Semitic. You attach the worst labels in the world. Fine, and it all fits. Unless you can change that regime, you cannot alter what will be a permanent acquisitive capacity of the regime to be X number of months or years away from producing a weapon. That's the problem that we confront. And unless you're prepared to mow the grass periodically, to strike militarily, and then have to strike again and again and again, that is a situation that cannot, it will not be tolerated. Sanctions would collapse under those circumstances, and the Iranians would have justification now to openly flaunt the IAEA and to produce a weapon. This situation, this is why I'm arguing to you, this is not a situation where there are binary choices. But in the end, we are narrowing the options to a binary choice. Bomb or accept the bomb. And I argue to you both are unpalatable. And that's the true, I mean, if this wasn't so serious, this would be the most exquisitely complicated problem in the international arena today. And nobody has an answer to it. And do not let anybody tell you that they, with any measure of authority, not the Americans, not the Israelis, anybody tell you that they have the answer to deal with the question of Iran's bomb. They don't. They don't.
Today at the City Club, we've been listening to a Friday forum featuring Aaron David Miller, Vice President for New Initiatives and Distinguished Scholar at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. Thank you, Mr. Miller. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This forum is adjourned. Thank you, Aaron.
For information on upcoming speakers or for podcasts of the City Club, go to cityclub.org.
PNC is proud to support the presentation of this City Club of Cleveland Friday Forum on WVIZ PBS.
Additional support comes from Cleveland State University. Support for closed caption transcripts of City Club forums is provided by the Nordson Corporation Foundation.